Please be seated. Over the last 3 weeks, we have been on a journey with Jesus as he headed toward Jerusalem, and we've witnessed 3 significant encounters. The first one was with a young man who had many possessions. He asked Jesus what he had to do to inherit eternal life. Jesus told him that he needed to let go of those possessions so that he would be free to follow him. And the man went away sad because he didn't like that answer. And Jesus remarked to his followers there gathered how hard it is for those with wealth to enter God's kingdom. The second one was with the 2 disciples, James and John, who also had a request of Jesus. They wanted Jesus to let them share in his glory, so that one would sit on his left and one would sit on his right. They showed that they did not understand who Jesus was or what to ask him for. Instead of eternal life, they wanted glory for themselves. And Jesus remarked that their calling is actually servanthood. Now today, Jesus is at Jericho, the ancient city that was the gate to the promised land. And on the side of the road sits a blind beggar who has nothing. He doesn't even really have a name because Bartimaeus, as he is called, just means son of Timaeus. The only thing he has is a cloak, which surely is his most precious possession, his shelter from the elements, protection from the cold, not to mention probably his chair and surely his bed. And Bartimaeus does know who Jesus is. He calls him Son of David, the Messiah. And he knows what he wants from him. He wants to be able to see, to be restored. When Jesus calls to him, Bartimaeus throws aside his cloak, his one and only greatly treasured possession. And he asked Jesus to simply heal him. His faith was such that he knew that he could let go of that cloak and he would get it back again and more when he was restored. He'd be able to see it lying right there where he left it. He asked the right question and he received what he asked for and everything that would go with the restoration in his first century world of healing. Bartimaeus' response to what Jesus did was to follow Jesus right there and then, headed for the promised land. With God, all things are possible. Jesus didn't even need to make a remark after this. Many of the stories about Jesus tend to focus on the seriously marginalized. It is indeed good news that they are especially picked out to be restored, to be freed, to be healed. But it also may leave us wondering, what about us? What about those of us who are not marginalized? The answer, of course, still is to follow Jesus. But how? Well, today's story gives us a way to do that too. Not only do we see Bartimaeus transformed, but we also see the crowd around Bartimaeus undergo a transformation as this story unfolds. That happens in just a couple of sentences, but it's worth a second look. In the beginning, when Bartimaeus is on the side of the road shouting for Jesus and asking for mercy, the crowd tries to shut him up. We're not told why, but there are some possibilities. Perhaps the crowd is ashamed that there is a beggar among them. Or perhaps the crowd feels that they should protect Jesus from people like Bartimaeus, believing he would be in some way contaminated or diminished, or might even be harmed by this guy, who is clearly not favored by God, because if he were, in their first century thinking, he would not be blind and begging. Or perhaps the crowd just disdains the beggar and wants to keep him on the margins, shut him up and make him go back to being invisible so that he won't ruin the day with his cries. Maybe they look down on him because he's disabled, or are resentful that he is interrupting their experience with his need. Whatever the reason, they are not able to put themselves in his shoes and imagine life from his perspective. But Jesus takes note of Bartimaeus. Jesus hears his cry and tells the crowd to call Bartimaeus to him. And this affects an immediate and profound change in the crowd. They see that Jesus has heard the cry of this man. They see that Jesus noticed this man, that Jesus wants to connect with this man. This changes everything for them. Suddenly, they see Bartimaeus as someone who Jesus wants to notice. They see him as somebody Jesus wants. Now things are different. And they see Bartimaeus in a new light. They go from wanting him to go away and shut up, to not mess up their experience, to showing mercy and genuine support. Take heart, they say. Take heart. He's calling you. Get up and go. It's not just the downtrodden who are the recipients of Jesus' mercy. It never is. We're not a bunch of monads running around unconnected to one another. We're all embedded in society, in community, and what happens to any of us affects all of us. Those of us who are privileged, which basically means those of us who don't have to think about those things like poverty and discrimination because we do not experience them ourselves, often do not recognize our privilege and are therefore sometimes blind to the experiences of others. We imagine that they have access to the same resources we do, the same opportunities, the same choices, the same perspectives. And we imagine that whatever happens to them doesn't have anything to do with us. But even the most privileged among us are nonetheless diminished when our society tramples the poor and casts people out because hatred and scorn and greed taint all of us. When Jesus shows up, things change. Bartimaeus asked to be able to see. We should ask to be able to see too, to see others, all others, especially the others for whom we may have scorn or disdain. Those others whose perspectives and experiences we have not had and maybe don't want to have, and see them as those to whom Jesus takes notice, as those who Jesus wants. Because when we see others in that way, the way Jesus sees them, we too will be transformed.